On December 7, 1941, at exactly 07:55, Doris Miller, a mess attendant second class on the USS West Virginia, was in the laundry room deep within the ship's bowels when an explosion shattered his routine and set off a chain of events that would profoundly impact both his life and the U.S. Navy. At 22 years old, he hailed from Waco, Texas, and had enlisted in September 1939 to provide financial support for his family. The Navy's role for African-American sailors was strictly limited to non-combat tasks such as cooking, dishwashing, and laundry duties. At the time of the attack, Miller had been serving on the West Virginia for 16 months and knew every nook and cranny of the vessel. He was well versed in the daily routines of the officers, including their preferred wake-up times and coffee preferences. On that fateful Sunday morning, December 7th, he adhered to his usual schedule of collecting dirty uniforms at 07:30 a.m. The laundry room was filled with the scent of soap and steam as Miller folded a pile of khaki shirts when suddenly, the ship took its first torpedo hit. The blast hurled him against the bulkhead, followed by flickering lights. The deck beneath him began to tilt, and Miller heard shouting from above, along with footsteps hurrying past and alarms blaring. He dropped the laundry he was carrying and sprinted towards his designated battle station. Miller knew precisely where it was, having been trained on its location dozens of times. Get to your station, stay there, and do your job. Passageways were crowded with sailors running in both directions, some heading to their stations while others tended to the wounded. Emergency lighting had flickered to life, bathing everything in a dim red hue. Water was rushing somewhere below deck, creating a sound like an indoor waterfall. When Miller reached where his battle station should have been, he found twisted metal and seawater pouring inside. A Japanese torpedo had punched through the port side of the ship right at his station, leaving a gaping hole roughly 20 feet wide. The magazine was flooded and completely destroyed, with daylight visible through the large breach in the hull. From his vantage point, he could observe the harbor waters outside. At precisely 07:58 hours, the first torpedo struck. This particular weapon, a Type 91 model, carried an explosive payload of 4,000 kilograms. Upon impact, the blast tore through the ship's armor belt and inundated several compartments with seawater. Miller remained frozen in place for approximately 5 seconds as he struggled to comprehend what was unfolding before him. Around him, other sailors were urgently working to seal watertight doors and hatches in an attempt to control the influx of water. Damage control teams had already mobilized. Men were sprinting back and forth with fire hoses and emergency equipment, while others set up temporary lighting solutions. Suddenly, a second explosion echoed through the ship. Another torpedo had hit farther forward, causing additional structural damage. The vessel shuddered under the force of this new impact, accompanied by more alarms and frantic shouts from crew members. As the situation worsened, the deck began to tilt increasingly to port. Miller could sense that the West Virginia was leaning dangerously. Within a few minutes, the ship had sustained 5 torpedo hits along her starboard side, each one creating new breaches in the hull through which thousands of gallons of seawater poured every minute. The risk of capsizing grew more imminent by the second. If the flooding persisted without intervention, the West Virginia faced the same fate as the Oklahoma, which was already listing heavily and sinking. Fearing for the ship's stability, Miller quickly made his way toward the main deck. Upon reaching the upper deck, Miller witnessed utter pandemonium. Japanese planes filled the sky, including dive bombers plunging downward with screeching engines, torpedo bombers gliding low above the harbor's waters, and fighter aircraft strafing ships with relentless machine gun fire. Plumes of smoke billowed from vessels stretching along Battleship Row. The USS Arizona was engulfed in flames while the USS Oklahoma began to capsize. Fires were rapidly spreading across multiple ships. Men could be seen leaping into the water for safety. Oil leaking from ruptured hulls ignited on the surface, adding another layer of danger and destruction. Gunfire echoed through the air along with explosions and the anguished cries of injured soldiers. The acrid scent of burning oil and cordite permeated the atmosphere, mingling with the metallic tang of heated machinery. Smoke filled his lungs as he breathed in deeply. He could sense the intense heat emanating from somewhere deep within the ship. An officer grabbed Miller amidst the cacophony and shouted urgently that the captain had been wounded and required assistance for movement. Miller then followed the officer towards the bridge to provide aid. Captain Mivan Charbon was 54 years old when he graduated third in his class from the Naval Academy in 1910. He had taken command of the USS West Virginia in June 1941, a position he held for only 6 months. Known for his meticulous approach and extensive experience, Captain Charbon enjoyed the respect of his crew. Throughout most of his career, he had served aboard battleships and was well-versed in naval tactics, damage control, and ship handling. In the months prior to December, he diligently trained his crew, ensuring they were ready for any eventuality. However, nothing could have prepared them for what transpired that morning. This particular weapon was a modified 16-inch armor-piercing naval shell fitted with fins for aerial deployment. The Japanese had adapted shells intended for battleship guns into effective bombs. Upon impact, the explosive penetrated the Tennessee's armor and detonated, sending shrapnel in every direction. Given the close proximity of the two vessels, debris from the blast reached the West Virginia's bridge. One particularly large piece of shrapnel, roughly 6 inches long with an irregular shape, had inflicted a devastating wound on Binion. The fragment tore through his abdomen and appeared to have struck his spine, causing catastrophic injuries. His intestines were hanging out, and his internal organs were visible through the torn flesh. A pool of dark red blood, nearly black, had formed around him on the deck. It mixed with splattered seawater and oil on the bridge. Although a medic had placed a field dressing over his wound, it was clear to everyone present that the captain was dying. The bandage was already drenched in blood, which continued to seep from beneath its edges. Despite being conscious, Binion was issuing orders for counter-flooding measures and fire suppression priorities. He also assigned tasks related to damage control. His voice remained steady despite the excruciating pain. When Miller and another sailor attempted to move him to a safer area, he refused. Binion insisted on staying at his post because he felt responsible for commanding his ship. Miller noticed that the captain's hands were trembling slightly, with one pressed firmly against his abdomen in an attempt to keep the wound closed. While blood continued to soak through the bandage, the captain continued to issue commands, and an officer instructed Miller to report to the anti-aircraft guns located on the starboard side of the ship. Upon arrival, he encountered a scene that left him utterly stunned. The entire crew was deceased, victims of Japanese strafing just moments before his arrival. Their bodies lay slumped around the gun mount. Despite this grim situation, the weapon itself remained functional and ready for use. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun, water-cooled and belt-fed, stood mounted on a pedestal. Miller had never received training on this particular firearm. Japanese aircraft were diving towards the ship, leaving no time for hesitation or compliance with protocol. No other personnel were available to take control of the gun. Without a moment's delay, Miller made a decision that flouted every regulation in the Navy manual. He seized the handles and began firing. The Browning .50 caliber weighed an impressive 25 pounds without its mount, capable of discharging up to 505 rounds per minute. Ammunition was stored in metal boxes, each containing belts ready for use. The weapon featured 2 water hoses connected to the barrel jacket to maintain cooling during extended firing sequences. Each ammunition belt contained 200 rounds, consisting of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer bullets. Tracer rounds were inserted every 5th round, creating a visible trail for the gunner to track his shots accurately. He grasped the fundamental mechanics involved: target acquisition, trigger pull, continuous barrel alignment with the aircraft's movement, and lead compensation. The recoil was intense upon firing, causing the mount to vibrate through the deck. The sound of the Browning machine gun firing rapidly overwhelmed all other auditory stimuli despite the surrounding cacophony of explosions and engine noise. Empty casings were ejected to the right, clattering on the deck with each burst. The smell of burnt powder was pervasive, mingling with the acrid scent of cordite and gun oil amid the smoke from fires across the harbor. Miller could sense every tremor through his hands and arms as he wielded the active and powerful weapon. He locked onto an approaching Japanese dive bomber, specifically a HDTA later known by Allied forces as a VAL, which had just released its payload over the USS Tennessee and was climbing away at approximately 209 TNT and was climbing away at across the trigger and kept it pressed down. Tracer rounds streaked toward the aircraft in a continuous stream of gunfire. Some shots missed their mark, veering off into the sky above the bomber. Others hit their target, causing sparks to fly along the fuselage where armor-piercing rounds struck metal. Despite the damage, the plane continued flying undeterred. The impact was insufficient to bring it down. Miller then redirected his aim at another incoming aircraft, an AH by Allied forces. This particular aircraft was approaching low over the water, heading straight for Battleship Row. It was approximately 50 feet above the harbor surface, with its torpedo clearly visible beneath the fuselage. Adjusting his aim to lead the target, Miller fired another burst of bullets, anticipating where the plane would be rather than where it currently was. This time, he saw parts of the aircraft's wing disintegrate as the rounds connected, sending control surface fragments tumbling away. Ultimately, the torpedo was released, and Miller momentarily lost track of it amid the chaos around him. He wasn't sure if he hit any targets because the action unfolded too quickly for him to follow individual shots. For about 15 minutes, Miller continued firing relentlessly. He manned the weapon and aimed at every Japanese plane that came into range. And the Unison barrage could, despite the water's efforts to keep it cool, and his shoulders ached from the constant recoil, and ringing filled his ears due to the deafening noise. He ceased firing only when an officer gave him a stop command. At that point, the gun had run out of ammunition. The ship was taking on water and starting to sink, forcing everyone aboard to prepare for abandoning it. Miller rushed to assist in moving injured sailors to the main deck as the West Virginia gradually sank deeper into the harbor. Water seeped through the lower levels while fires spread across the vessel despite efforts to counter them with flooding measures. Although the list of port had stabilized somewhat, it was clear that the ship was sinking. He helped carry wounded men up ladders and through smoke-filled passageways, past spreading fires and flooded compartments. The deck was slick with oil and blood, making every step treacherous. His hands bore burns from touching scorching metal, and his uniform was drenched with seawater and the blood of fallen comrades. All he could hear was an incessant ringing in his ears. As Miller made his way past the bridge, Captain Bennin was still issuing orders, though his voice had grown fainter. It was clear that the captain's strength was waning due to severe blood loss. Sometime before 0900 hours, Captain Bennin succumbed on the bridge, steadfastly refusing to abandon his post until he could no longer speak. The Navy would later posthumously bestow upon him the Medal of Trip in recognition of his unwavering courage and leadership. Miller was among the last few sailors to depart from the stricken West Virginia, which had endured 7 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. Over 100 crew members lost their lives, with many more wounded. The battleship gradually settled onto the harbor floor, leaving only her superstructure visible above water. Fires continued to rage for hours afterward, while some men remained trapped below deck in sealed compartments, succumbing to asphyxiation over the next few days as their oxygen supplies ran dry. Miller swam through water heavily coated in oil to reach safety, where he found that parts of it were on fire. Navigating amidst floating patches of flame and smoke, he encountered Japanese aircraft lingering above, even though their assault was nearing its end. What greeted Miller's eyes was a scene of devastation beyond his wildest imaginings. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers also sustaining injuries. Untold aircraft destroyed, and casualties numbering 240 dead and another 178 wounded. The United States Pacific Fleet had suffered crippling losses in just a single morning. He then made his way to sick bay, where medics examined him for any injuries. Burns on his hands from gripping hot metal and gun handles were evident, along with hearing damage due to prolonged exposure to gunfire without adequate protection. Bruises and cuts covered parts of his body from being tossed about during the explosions. Despite these injuries, none posed an immediate threat to his life. Miller was then taken to a temporary barracks facility while naval authorities decided on the best course of action for survivors from the damaged vessels. No one inquired about what Miller did during the attack. Mess attendants were merely expected to survive. Official reports from the USS West Virginia mentioned unnamed sailors who had manned weapons, but no names were recorded. The Navy's focus was on assessing damage, counting casualties, and preparing for war. Individual acts of bravery by enlisted men, particularly black enlisted men, were not a priority for documentation. Afterward, Miller resumed his regular duties. In December 1941, he was reassigned to the USS Indianapolis, where he continued working as a mess attendant, serving meals, cleaning quarters, and doing laundry. The war proceeded, and the Navy required cooks more than it needed heroes. Miller nor the Navy realized at the time that word of what transpired on the West Virginia's bridge was spreading through unofficial channels. Survivors shared stories with other sailors about what they had witnessed. Someone had manned a machine gun on the West Virginia for 15 minutes without any training, firing back at Japanese aircraft and assisting in moving Captain Bennon while helping to save wounded sailors. That someone was Doris Miller, a mess attendant. By January 1942, the story reached the black press, with the Pittsburgh Courier beginning its investigation into who this unnamed hero was. They sought to understand why the Navy failed to recognize him. They questioned why a black sailor who bravely resisted Japanese forces went unacknowledged in official documents. Pressure mounted on the Navy as couriers lobbied for answers, and other African American newspapers chimed in. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People also became involved. Civil rights groups pressed for information relentlessly. By March 1942, the Navy finally verified mess attendant second-class Doris Miller's identity. His story gained rapid traction. Overnight, Miller achieved fame. He became a war hero for the black community, a figure who demonstrated that black sailors could indeed fight, someone who displayed immense courage under enemy fire, and someone who broke discriminatory rules to protect his vessel and nation. According to protocol, he should have faced disciplinary action, but public demand was overwhelming. The black media clamored for acknowledgement of his heroic actions. Civil rights activists were leveraging Miller's story to advocate for the desegregation of the military. His tale garnered attention from white newspapers, elevating him to a symbol of change. In response, the Navy decided to acknowledge his actions with an award. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, bestowed upon Miller the Navy Cross during a ceremony on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise at Pearl Harbor. The ship had been away from port when the attack occurred, sparing it from destruction and making it a potent symbol of American naval might. In the Pacific, Nimitz pinned the medal to Miller's uniform, noting that this was unprecedented within the Pacific Fleet for a member of his race. His statement served dual purposes, recognizing Miller's valor while also highlighting the ongoing significance of racial distinctions within the Navy. The Navy Cross ranked as the third highest decoration for bravery at the time, second only to the Medal of Honor and the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. In 1942, however, it was actually second highest due to a pending reorganization of military decorations that would occur in August. Miller became the first black sailor to receive this prestigious award. While his honor was genuine, reflecting true courage under fire, it also met certain political objectives for the Navy at the time. To address pressure from civil rights groups and the African American press, the Navy honored Miller publicly while preserving its segregated practices. Despite this recognition, Miller remained a mess attendant after receiving his medal and promotion to first class. The Navy Cross was an acknowledgement of his actions, but did not grant him any additional privileges or roles within the military hierarchy. Photographers captured the moment during the ceremony, and these images were widely shared in newspapers nationwide. Dressed in his formal attire, Miller stood with impeccable military bearing, though his discomfort was evident. His face reflected none of the anticipated satisfaction or pride. Instead, it suggested a sense of duty while being photographed. The Miller's primary motivation for joining the Navy had been to support his family financially, and accolades were merely the circumstances of the time. On June 1, 1942, Miller was promoted to mess attendant first class, which came with better pay but did not change the nature of his duties. Cooking, serving, and cleaning remained part of his responsibilities. The Navy wasn't prepared to embrace combat roles for African-American sailors, but Miller compelled them to recognize that black sailors were capable fighters. This acknowledgement marked a significant step toward change. In April 1942, before Miller officially received the Navy Cross, Secretary of the Navy William Franklin Knox announced the establishment of an all-black naval training facility in Illinois. Additionally, he addressed the first graduating class of black sailors from the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. In 1943, Miller appeared on a recruiting poster designed by David Stone Martin, which featured him in full-dress uniform looking directly at viewers with the words "Above and Beyond the Call of Duty" beneath his picture. The poster was widely distributed to attract more African-American sailors into the Navy. He also delivered speeches at various war bond rallies throughout the country. He exchanged handshakes with civilians and posed for photographs repeatedly. The same questions were asked numerous times. What was the experience like? Were you afraid? How did you learn to operate the weapon? Miller's answers tended to be concise. He stated that operating the gun wasn't difficult. He simply pulled the trigger, and it functioned as expected. During training, he observed other sailors handling firearms. He believed he had managed to hit one of the enemy aircraft, which were diving quite close. Beyond these basic details, Miller did not provide much additional information. Public speaking was not his forte. He saw himself merely as a cook who fulfilled necessary duties without any grand sense of self-importance. However, despite this modest view of himself, both the Navy and the nation required him to be seen as exceptional for symbolic reasons. Although he would have preferred to avoid such attention, Miller accommodated the role as needed. In February 1943, the Navy altered the rating title from mess attendant to steward's mate, a superficial change, but one that signified a growing acknowledgement of the respect due to black sailors. The job remained unchanged, but the atmosphere had evolved. Miller's war bonds tour concluded, and he petitioned for a return to active duty aboard a combat vessel. In May of 1943, the Navy reassigned him to Puget Sound Naval Yard in Bremerton, Washington. There, he was enlisted on the newly built escort carrier Liscon Bay, CVE 56. The ship measured 5.12 feet in length and had a beam width of 65 feet, displacing 88 tons. Powered by twin reciprocating steam engines, it could achieve a top speed of 19 knots. With a flight deck extending to 47.7 feet, the hangar deck accommodated roughly 28 aircraft, depending on configuration. Liscon Bay was one of 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers rapidly constructed for the Pacific theater. Unlike larger fleet carriers designed for major naval engagements, these vessels were tasked with air support during amphibious landings, convoy protection, and ferrying aircraft. The crew consisted of 60 men. On June 1, 1943, Miller received a promotion to cook third class. His salary increased once more, but his duties in the galley remained the same, preparing meals for officers and sailors alike. After completing shakedown exercises, Liscon Bay departed from Pearl Harbor on October 22, 1943. Over the next several weeks, she trained off the coast of Hawaii before setting sail again on November 10, bound for Task Force 52 in support of operations against the Gilbert Islands, with a primary focus on Makin and Tarawa atolls. Operation Galvanic commenced on November 20th, marking the first significant American offensive in the Central Pacific. Carrier-based aircraft were two ground troops advancing on Micken Island. Carrier-based aircraft were tasked with close air support. Reconnaissance progress was steady as American forces captured the islands. The garrison at Macon faced near annihilation. Despite these successes, the Japanese submarine I-175 posed a threat in the vicinity of Macon. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Sunso Tabata, the submarine entered the area on November 23, positioning itself outside the protective perimeter of American destroyers. On November 24, 1943, at signal was raised aboard Liscum Bay. Miller got up, dressed, and went to the galley to start breakfast preparations. The ship's activities were routine as aircraft were being ready for that day's missions. Flight crews inspected their planes, and the hangar deck buzzed with activity. 13 planes were positioned on the flight deck, fully fueled and armed, while 7 more awaited fueling in the hangar. According to Navy records, he was stationed near frame 14-7 on the starboard side of the carrier's hull, operating a 20-minute aircraft gun. The ship was sailing northeast at approximately 15 knots. Liscum Bay had positioned herself in such a way that her broadside faced the area where I-1715 was hiding. A 255 was hiding at 055 wake of an approaching torpedo and raised the alarm. The trail of white bubbles left no doubt about the nature of the threat. Torpedo inbound, starboard side. However, it was too late to take evasive action. There wasn't enough time to change course or alter position. Impact occurred at Seafind 513, when the torpedo struck Liscum Bay just forward of the engine room on the starboard side, with a force akin to hitting an immovable barrier at full speed. This collision was swiftly followed by a massive explosion. The Type 95 torpedo carried 490 kilograms of high explosive, tearing through the ship's hull and sending shockwaves throughout its structure. But this wasn't the end. The impact also set off a chain reaction in the adjacent aviation bomb storage magazine. These bombs were fully armed and prepared for that day's operations, including 500-pound and 1,000-pound explosives. The initial torpedo blast ignited these munitions, leading to another devastating explosion. The second explosion was devastating and far more destructive than the initial torpedo strike. It tore through every level of the carrier from bottom to top with immense force, blowing out large sections of the hull. The flight deck bulged upwards before rupturing open, releasing a colossal fireball that sent flames and debris soaring hundreds of feet into the air. Ships located 10 miles away could still observe the intense explosion. Shrapnel was hurled in all directions, with some pieces traveling over 5,000 yards. Various parts of the ship, aircraft, and equipment turned into projectiles. Debris fell on nearby vessels, including the USS New Mexico, a battleship positioned approximately 15 miles away as part of the task force. The New Mexico's deck was hit by wreckage from Lisp Bay, with some recognizable pieces of aircraft mixed with unidentifiable twisted metal. The blast instantly killed everyone in the aft section and completely obliterated those near the bomb magazine. Adjacent compartments suffered casualties due to the shockwave, flash fires, or falling debris. The forward hangar deck was engulfed in flames as aviation fuel from ruptured fuel tanks ignited. The fire rapidly engulfed the hangar within seconds. Aircraft on the flight deck were either hurled into the air by the blast or set ablaze by the ensuing flames. Some planes remained intact and were jettisoned overboard, while others disintegrated. One Grumman Wildcat fighter was discovered floating a mile away from where Lisp Bay sank. .500-pound bombs detonated, as did 50-caliber ammunition belts. Ruptured fuel tanks added to the inferno. The explosion instantly killed everyone in the aft section of the vessel. The forward hangar deck was consumed by fire, and aircraft on the flight deck were either launched into the air or incinerated. Fuel and ammunition began cooking off inside the hangar, triggering further explosions that ravaged what little remained of the ship. Power failed immediately, and water mains broke, exacerbating the crisis. Fire spread quickly across various sections of the vessel. The flight deck warped and twisted from heat and structural damage. Within minutes, it was evident that Lisk Bay was doomed. Survivors attempted to reach the main deck after enduring the initial explosion. Numerous individuals became trapped by flames and flooding, while others sustained injuries that prevented them from moving. As a result, the surviving crew members started evacuating the vessel. The sea was coated with burning fuel oil, forcing swimmers to navigate through patches of fire. Some had life jackets, whereas others were without any flotation devices. At precisely 0:53:30, just 23 minutes after being struck by a torpedo, Lisk Bay rolled onto its starboard side and sank, submerging stern first. A total of 642 men perished in the explosion and subsequent sinking. Among them were Captain Irving Wiltsey, Rear Admiral Henry Molin, who commanded Carrier Division 24, and Cook Third Class Doris Miller. Destroyers from the task force swiftly arrived on scene to rescue survivors. These included USS Morris, USS Hughes, USS Hughes, USS Hughes, USS Hughes, one of whom had already succumbed to burns, drowning, or injuries. Others died even after being pulled from the sea despite the rescue efforts. The total number of survivors recovered by these destroyers was 272. Rescue operations were perilous due to the presence of Japanese submarine I-75 in the vicinity. While attempting rescue missions, the destroyers carried out depth charge attacks and detected what might have been the enemy submarine using sonar before deploying explosives. It remained uncertain whether any targets were hit. The surviving crew members were moved to other vessels within the task force and transported to Hawaii for medical care. He had been 24 years old at the time. Posthumously, Miller was awarded a Purple Heart, which added to his existing Navy Cross and Battle Stars for distinguished service. However, for those familiar with his story, these honors seemed inadequate. His legacy became an emblem for Black Americans, striving for equality within both the military and society. Yet, in the end, Miller was gone. Japanese submarine I-75 continued its operations in the Pacific following the sinking of Liscombe Bay. Lieutenant Commander Tabata then navigated his vessel back to Japanese waters, but their fortune did not last long. On February 4, 1944, while operating near Kwajalein Atoll during an American invasion, I-75 was detected by USS Cheerio and USS Fair using sonar. The destroyers launched Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars which successfully struck the submarine, sinking it with its entire crew on board. Tabata and his men perished in this engagement. The submarine responsible for killing Miller along with more than 600 American sailors was ultimately destroyed. Miller's legacy did not conclude with his death, rather, it began to gain significant traction thereafter. During his lifetime, the Navy had grudgingly acknowledged Miller's contributions. Following his passing, his story became even more potent as a symbol demanding change within the military. The black press persisted in highlighting Miller's tale, using it to advocate for full desegregation of the armed forces. Civil rights groups leveraged Miller's example to demonstrate that segregation was both unethical and detrimental. By effectively manning an anti-aircraft gun without proper training, Miller had undermined the Navy's assertion that African American sailors were unsuitable for combat roles. His actions cast doubt on the military's policies and highlighted the wasted potential of many capable men relegated to kitchen duties instead of frontline positions. To what extent did the military compromise its combat readiness by upholding racial segregation? How could a nation fighting for freedom abroad justify denying it to its own people at home? The Navy gradually started to undergo changes. In 1944, the service began accepting black sailors into general duty roles beyond just steward positions. This marked a significant shift in policy, Black sailors were now eligible to train as gunners' mates, radio men, quartermasters, and other technical ratings. While they still faced segregation and discrimination in many areas, the outright ban on combat training had been lifted. In 1945, the Navy commissioned its first black officers. 12 men graduated from officer candidate school as ensigns. This represented another critical breakthrough against racial barriers. Black servicemen were now able to lead both black and white sailors. Although some changes occurred slowly and were insufficient in many respects, they were often hindered by officers who resisted integration. In July 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 1998-1, which mandated the desegregation of all armed forces branches. The order stipulated equal treatment and opportunity for everyone in the military, regardless of race, color, religion, or national origin. While full implementation took time and some branches resisted more than others, the legal framework for desegregation had been firmly established. The lengthy process was finally completed after several years, with its groundwork well established along the way. Doris Miller's actions on December 7, 1941, played a crucial role in laying that foundation, though it wasn't the sole or most significant factor in terms of policy shifts. His deeds were nonetheless highly visible and emotionally resonant. When reflecting on racial integration within the military, many Americans think about Doris Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor, an enduring symbol in the broader civil rights movement. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the frigate USS Miller, a 40-38-foot ship built at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia. The vessel served with distinction in both the Atlantic Fleet and Mediterranean waters throughout the Cold War era before being decommissioned after 18 years of service in 1991. A bronze memorial plaque was unveiled on October 12, 1991, what would have been Miller's 72nd birthday, at Doris Miller Park near Naval Station, Pearl Harbor. Bringing the character to life. While some liberties were taken with historical accuracy for dramatic effect, the movie ensured that a new generation learned about this pivotal figure in American history. In 2010, the United States Postal Service commemorated Miller alongside 3 other distinguished sailors on a special stamp, depicting him in his Navy uniform adorned with the Navy Cross. 4 years later, in 2014, the Department of Veterans Affairs named its medical center in Waco, Texas, the Doris Miller VA Medical Center after him. The facility provides comprehensive healthcare services to veterans in Central Texas. On December 7, 2007, a 9-foot bronze statue honoring Doris Miller was unveiled in Waco, marking the 76th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack and serving as a lasting tribute to his enduring legacy. The statue is located along the shores of the Brazos River, depicting Miller in his military uniform gazing out over the water. On January 20, 2015, Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas May announced that the Navy would name its upcoming aircraft carrier after Doris Miller. This vessel will be designated as CBN-81 and is part of the Gerald Ford-class fleet of nuclear-powered supercarriers. Construction on the ship began in 2004, with an estimated commissioning date around 2023. Upon completion, USS Doris Miller will join the ranks of some of the most formidable warships ever constructed. At a length exceeding 1,000 feet and powered by nuclear reactors, it will be capable of carrying up to 75 aircraft and will require a crew of roughly 400-500 sailors. The ship is expected to serve for at least 5 decades. Aircraft carriers are traditionally named after presidents, members of Congress, or 4-star admirals. Miller, however, his contributions and influence on both naval operations and American society earned him this distinction. What sets Miller's story apart isn't just his actions on December 7, 1941, it is what those actions symbolized and how they paved the way for future changes. At a time when black sailors were expected to serve only as cooks or stewards, while being barred from operating weapons, a policy enforced by regulations and upheld by deeply ingrained traditions, Miller's achievements challenged these long-held beliefs and opened doors for others. In just 15 minutes of relentless gunfire against enemy aircraft, Miller debunked their doubts. His actions were further exemplified by his assistance in moving a critically injured captain to safety and aiding other sailors as the ship sank beneath him. By surviving and continuing his service, he demonstrated resilience. Moreover, he returned to combat despite having ample reasons to leave the military entirely. Miller was acutely aware that the Navy was unfair and designed to restrict his advancement. Yet, during wartime, he chose duty over personal grievances. This form of bravery differs from the courage displayed in battle, which is the valor of challenging a system while upholding it simultaneously. Against the Japanese and American racism alike, Miller engaged in battles where victories and defeats alternated, but he never ceased to fight. Thanks to individuals like him, the United States military underwent transformation, albeit slowly, laboriously, yet inexorably. When an untrained cook could operate anti-aircraft weaponry effectively against enemy planes, it became untenable to argue for segregated combat roles based on race. Similarly, a sailor earning the Navy Cross and resuming his duties without complaint made it impossible to sustain claims that promotion should be limited by skin color. Furthermore, when someone achieved national hero status and used this platform to advocate for equal treatment, the notion of separate but equal could no longer hold water. Miller accomplished all these feats, not with permission requested, but because they were necessary. By undertaking these actions, he played a pivotal role in dismantling an entrenched system that had endured for centuries. The Navy that honored USS Doris Miller in WWII is markedly different from the one that limited Miller to working as a cook in 1939. This transformation was driven by many individuals who advocated for change over the years, and Miller was among them. His brief but impactful moment on December 7, 1941, firing a machine gun during the Pearl Harbor attack, left an enduring legacy that lasted for decades. Miller's parents, Connery and Henrietta, spent the remainder of their lives knowing he had given his life in service to his nation. They preserved his medals and photographs, attended numerous memorial services, and occasionally spoke with journalists about their son. While proud of his accomplishments, they were also deeply saddened by his loss. His siblings carried forward his legacy. His brothers joined the military during World War II. One of them shared the family nickname Doris, a moniker that had been passed down to him from an older generation. They saw his image featured on recordman posters and read articles about him in newspapers. People across the country wrote letters expressing admiration for what he had achieved, yet they never recovered their son's body. He vanished, swallowed by the Pacific after Liscum Bay sank beneath the waves. There were no remains for them to enter or a grave to visit. All that remained were memories, medals, and the awareness that Doris had accomplished something remarkable. The Navy later concluded that Miller was likely at his assigned station when the torpedo struck. If he manned the starboard 20 mm gun, he would have been very near the point of impact. The blast would have taken his life immediately. He probably never saw it coming. That much is some comfort. He did not endure pain or burn or drown. One instant he was alive, and in the next he was gone. However, many others aboard Liscum Bay met painful fates. They perished amidst raging fires, succumbed while drowning in oil-slicked waters, or endured prolonged suffering from their injuries. In this regard, Miller was one of the fortunate ones. His passing was swift. What would Miller think about the USS Doris Miller? It's impossible to know for certain. He wasn't someone who craved fame or recognition. Joining the Navy wasn't about gaining glory for him. He didn't operate the gun at Pearl Harbor to seek accolades either. When Japanese planes attacked his ship, he manned the weapon because it was necessary, and somebody had to respond. He knew how to handle the gun adequately, so he used it without hesitation. This hands-on attitude characterized Miller's philosophy. Identify what needs doing, take action immediately, don't wait for instructions or fear breaking rules. That pragmatic approach earned him the Navy Cross. It also spurred significant changes within the United States Navy. Moreover, his courage in the face of adversity made him a symbol for civil rights. One dad, neediest. Decades after his passing, the Navy named an aircraft carrier after this cook from Waco, Texas, who defied orders not to fight and instead stood up against injustice. If you found this story inspiring, please like the video to help us share more stories about individuals whose bravery reshaped history. Subscribe to stay updated with similar content. Share a comment with us about your location. Our audience is worldwide, encompassing individuals ranging from veterans to students to history buffs who all contribute to preserving these memories. We appreciate your engagement by watching and reflecting on the past. Thank you for recognizing that Miller's struggle persists. The ongoing fight for equality, acknowledgement, and justice continues unabated. If Miller were here today, he would likely urge us to stop discussing him and start taking action. Let's pay tribute to him by doing just that.